The village of Kalinda sat under a blanket of stars, the kind of stars so bright they seemed to whisper secrets to the earth below. Life here was quiet, predictable, until you met Naima. Naima wasn't like the others. While the villagers worked, tirelessly fishing, trading, or tilling their small patches of land, she spent her days observing. She had a way of seeing the cracks in things, noticing what others overlooked. People said she had eyes that could pierce through lies, but they also said that kind of insight came with a cost. That evening, as the market was winding down, Naima lingered among the stalls. The smell of smoked fish mixed with the tangy aroma of tamarind, and faint laughter drifted from a group of children playing nearby. It was an ordinary scene until her sharp ears caught something unusual. Two voices, low, urgent, and clearly trying not to be heard, emanated from the shadows, behind a straw-roofed hut. Naima stopped, pretending to inspect a woven basket at a vendor's stall. Her eyes darted to the corner of the hut where the voices were coming from. One voice was familiar. Kwesi, the wealthiest man in the village. Everyone knew him. He owned the best land, controlled the trade routes, and had a way of making people feel small with just a glance. The other voice was a stranger's, deep and gravelly, with an accent that hinted he wasn't from Kalinda. "Are you sure it's still there?" the stranger asked, his tone sharp and impatient. "Of course," Kwesi replied, though there was an edge of defensiveness in his voice. "The treasure of Kalinda has remained untouched for decades. No one knows where it is, except me." Naima's heart skipped a beat. The treasure of Kalinda? That was no ordinary rumor. Everyone in the village had heard the legend. Kalinda, a merchant from decades ago, was said to have stolen a fortune in gold and jewels from the king. Some claimed he had been killed, while others believed he had buried the treasure and vanished. The story had always been a source of idle gossip, something to pass the time on quiet nights. But if Kwesi's words were true, then the treasure wasn't just a tale, it was real. She crept closer, her bare feet silent against the packed dirt. The two men were standing with their backs to her, deep in conversation. "The key is timing," Kwesi continued. "We'll need to move before the rains come. The ground will be harder to dig, and people will grow suspicious if they see us going into the forest." Naima felt a shiver run down her spine. The forest was a sacred place, full of ancient trees and whispered superstitions. No one went there lightly. If Kwesi and this stranger were planning to venture into its depths, they weren't just looking for treasure, they were taking a risk that could bring consequences. "Tomorrow night, then," the stranger said, his voice dropping so low Naima had to strain to hear. "You bring the map, I'll bring the tools. No mistakes." With that, the two men moved away, their figures dissolving into the shadows. Naima remained frozen, her mind racing. She knew Kwesi's reputation. He wasn't the kind of man who shared wealth or trusted anyone easily. If he was involving someone from outside the village, whatever they were after must be more valuable than anyone could imagine. For a moment, she considered letting it go. It wasn't her business, and meddling in Kwesi's affairs could be dangerous. But the thought of that treasure, the idea that it might contain answers to the mystery of Kalinda's disappearance, gnawed at her. What if the treasure wasn't just gold? What if it held something more important, something that could change everything? The stars above seemed to flicker, as if urging her forward. Naima made a decision. She would follow Kwesi and the stranger. She would uncover the truth, no matter the cost. As she turned to leave, a faint breeze rustled the trees, carrying with it the faintest whisper. "Be careful, Naima." She didn't know if it was her imagination or a warning from the spirits of the forest, but she couldn't shake the feeling that her life was about to change forever. And so, with the night as her ally and curiosity as her guide, Naima stepped into the shadows, ready to uncover a secret that had been buried for decades. The morning sun rose lazily over Kalinda, casting a golden haze over the thatched roofs and narrow dirt paths. The village bustled with its usual rhythm, women balancing pots of water on their heads, men hauling in fishing nets from the river, and children laughing as they chased each other. But Naima's mind was far from the everyday. Her thoughts were tangled with the whispers of the night before, the words, "treasure of Kalinda," echoing in her head like the persistent beat of a drum. She had barely slept. Lying on her straw mat, she replayed every detail she'd overheard. The urgency in Quasi's voice, the stranger's accent, the plan to go into the forest. Naima wasn't one to ignore her instincts, and they were screaming at her that this was more than just a greedy man's pursuit of gold. Something about it felt dangerous. By mid-morning, Naima had made up her mind. She couldn't confront Quasi directly. Not yet. But she needed more information. The market was the heart of the village, and if there was gossip to be found, it would be there. Walking purposefully, she weaved through the stalls, her sharp eyes scanning for Quasi. She found him near the spice trader's stand, examining bundles of dried herbs with his usual air of authority. Naima approached with casual ease, her expression neutral, as if she had nothing more pressing on her mind than the weather. "Quasi," she said, her voice light, "you've been quite busy these days. I hear you've been spending a lot of time near the forest." Quasi turned to her, his face a mask of politeness, but his eyes narrowed slightly. "Ah, Naima. Always curious, aren't you?" "Yes, I've been inspecting my lands. A man must ensure his property is in order." His words were smooth, but Naima caught the flicker of unease in his tone. "The forest is an interesting choice," she said, tilting her head as if pondering. "It's not a place many would go without a good reason." Quasi chuckled, though it sounded forced. "It's just land, Naima. Nothing more." He glanced at her briefly before turning back to the spices. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have business to attend to." As he walked away, Naima felt a rush of satisfaction. Quasi's reaction had confirmed her suspicions. He was hiding something, but she couldn't do this alone. If Quasi and the stranger were venturing into the forest, they'd be prepared for trouble. Naima needed someone she could trust, someone who could move silently and face danger without hesitation. There was only one person who fit that description: Ayodele. Ayodele was a hunter, known for his sharp instincts and unmatched agility. Naima found him just outside the village, repairing his traps under the shade of a baobab tree. He looked up, as she approached, his face breaking into a small smile. "Naima," he greeted her, "what brings you out here? Don't tell me you're planning to take up hunting." She smirked. "Not quite, but I do need your skills for something important." Ayodele raised an eyebrow. "Important enough to drag me away from my work?" "More important than you realize," Naima replied, lowering her voice. "It's about Quasi. He's up to something, and I need your help to find out what." As she explained what she'd overheard, Ayodele listened intently, his expression growing serious. When she finished, he leaned back against the tree, arms crossed. "You're sure about this?" he asked. "I am," Naima said firmly. "Something isn't right, Ayodele. I can feel it." He studied her for a moment, then nodded. "All right. If you're willing to take the risk, so am I. But we'll need to be careful. Quasi doesn't play games." That evening, under the cover of darkness, Naima and Ayodele set out. Armed with nothing but Ayodele's hunting spear and Naima's sharp mind, they followed the path into the forest, guided by the landmarks she had memorized from the previous night. "I can feel it." After what felt like hours, they stumbled upon a clearing. The ground was disturbed, the dirt freshly turned. In the center, hidden beneath a pile of branches, was what they had been searching for, a small, partially buried wooden chest. Naima's heart pounded as they approached. She knelt beside the chest, her fingers brushing against the worn wood. "This is it," she murmured. "The treasure of Kalinda." But before they could celebrate, a voice rang out, cutting through the stillness like a blade. "Step away from the chest." Naima and Ayodele froze. They turned slowly to see Quasi and the stranger stepping out of the shadows, their faces hard, their hands gripping weapons. And just like that, the mystery had become a confrontation, and Naima realized their journey was far from over. The clearing fell silent, save for the faint rustle of leaves overhead. Naima's pulse thundered in her ears as she stared at Kwesi and the stranger. Kwesi held a machete, its blade catching the moonlight, while the stranger gripped a wooden club with a steady hand. The tension in the air was as thick as the humid forest mist. "I knew someone would be nosy enough to follow," Kwesi said, his voice low and venomous. His gaze locked on Naima. "But I didn't expect it to be you." Naima forced herself to stand tall, despite the fear prickling her skin. "You're hiding something, Kwesi, something that doesn't belong to you." Kwesi's laugh was sharp and humorless. "And what would you know about that, little Naima? You've always been good at poking your nose where it doesn't belong. But this is beyond you." Ayodele stepped forward, his spear glinting faintly in the dim light. "Maybe, but if it's so beyond her, why are you so nervous?" The stranger shifted uneasily, his eyes darting between Ayodele's weapon and the chest partially unearthed behind them. Kwesi shot him a sharp look, silencing whatever words he was about to say. "I'll make this simple," Kwesi said, his voice cold. "Step away from the chest and walk back to the village. Forget you ever saw this, and I'll forget you were here." Naima's heart raced. She knew Kwesi wasn't bluffing. If they gave up the chest now, they'd never know what it contained, or why Kwesi was so desperate to keep it hidden. She glanced at Ayodele, who gave her the faintest nod. "I don't think so," Naima said, stepping closer to the chest. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled as she reached for the edge of the lid. Kwesi's expression darkened. "You're making a mistake." Before he could make a move, Ayodele lunged, his spear slicing through the air with practiced precision. The stranger barely had time to react, stumbling backward to avoid the blow. The clearing erupted into chaos. Kwesi charged at Naima, swinging his machete in a wide arc. She ducked, her hands scraping against the rough earth as she scrambled away. Behind her, Ayodele and the stranger were locked in a fierce struggle, the clatter of weapons echoing through the trees. Naima's mind raced. She had no weapon, no plan, and no time to think, but she wasn't about to let Kwesi win. As he advanced again, she grabbed a handful of dirt and flung it into his eyes. He roared in pain, clutching his face, giving her the chance to dart toward the chest. Her fingers fumbled with the latch, her breath coming in short gasps. Finally, the lid creaked open, revealing the contents inside, but it wasn't gold or jewels that met her gaze. Instead, the chest was filled with papers, yellowed maps, faded letters, and a bundle of worn notebooks tied with a piece of frayed twine. Naima's confusion was momentary. Then she realized what she was looking at. These weren't just documents, they were records. The maps detailed trade routes, the letters spoke of transactions, and the notebooks held the truth about Kalinda. As she flipped through one of them, her eyes widened. Kalinda hadn't been a thief. He had been framed. The records detailed a conspiracy orchestrated by none other than Kwesi's ancestors to steal the merchant's fortune and pin the blame on him. The so-called treasure wasn't wealth. It was evidence. Behind her, Kwesi had recovered. His face was twisted with rage as he lunged for her, his machete raised. But before he could strike, Ayodele's spear flew through the air, landing at his feet. "That's enough," Ayodele said, his voice firm. He stood over the stranger, who lay groaning on the ground, defeated. "It's over, Kwesi." Kwesi hesitated, his eyes darting between Ayodele's determined stance and Naima, who clutched the papers tightly in her hands. He seemed to weigh his options, but the fight had left him. With a growl of frustration, he dropped the machete and stepped back. "This isn't the end," he spat, his gaze burning into Naima's. "You don't know what you're meddling with." Naima met his glare head-on. "I know enough." With Ayodele's help, she packed the chest and its contents, determined to bring the truth back to the village. As they left the clearing, the forest seemed to come alive again, its whispers now less foreboding, as if it had been waiting for this moment of revelation. What had started as a simple curiosity had turned into a battle for justice, and Naima knew this was only the beginning. The treasure of Kalinda wasn't just a chest of papers. It was a chance to rewrite history. But she also knew Kwesi wouldn't give up easily. The path back to the village stretched ahead, filled with uncertainty. But Naima felt a fire in her chest, a resolve she had never known before. Whatever came next, she would be ready. The walk back to the village felt like a journey between two worlds. The forest, with its dense canopy and eerie whispers, gave way to the soft glow of Kalinda's lamps, but the weight of what Naima and Ayodele carried seemed heavier with each step. The chest of papers, secured tightly in Ayodele's arms, was no ordinary burden. It held the truth about a betrayal that had poisoned their village's history for generations. Naima's mind raced as they approached the edge of the village. What would she do with what she had uncovered? How could she present this truth without setting the community ablaze with conflict? And most pressing of all, how would Kwesi respond? His parting words in the forest, threatening and ominous, echoed in her thoughts like a drumbeat. "We need to be careful," Ayodele said, breaking the silence. He glanced over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the shadows. "Kwesi won't take this lightly. He'll come after us." Naima nodded, her grip tightening on the notebook she had insisted on carrying herself. "Then we can't waste time. We have to show these to the elders before he has a chance to twist the story." The village was quiet when they arrived, its usual nighttime hum muted, as if the air itself sensed the weight of their discovery. Naima and Ayodele headed straight to the home of Elder Abasi, the most respected figure in Kalinda. His wisdom and fairness were legendary, and if anyone could help them navigate this storm, it was him. Abasi's hut was modest but sturdy, its walls adorned with carvings of ancestral symbols. The elder was sitting by the fire, his lined face illuminated by the flickering flames. He looked up as they entered, his gaze sharp and curious. "Naima? Ayodele? What brings you here at this hour?" Without hesitation, Naima knelt before him, placing the notebook on the woven mat at his feet. "Elder, we've uncovered something that changes everything we thought we knew about Kalinda and our past." Abasi leaned forward, his expression unreadable as he picked up the notebook and began to flip through its pages. His eyes scanned the words carefully, and as he read, his face grew darker. "These are serious accusations," he said finally, his voice low. "If this is true, if Kalinda was framed—" "It is true," Naima said firmly. "We found these in the forest, buried in a chest. Kwesi and a stranger were trying to hide them. They attacked us when we got too close." At the mention of Kwesi's name, Abasi's expression hardened. "And where is he now?" "He's still in the forest," Ayodele said. "But he won't stay there long. He knows we've brought these back." Abasi nodded, his fingers tapping the edge of the notebook. "This cannot be kept quiet. The people must know the truth, but it must be handled carefully. If Kwesi's family truly conspired to frame Kalinda, it could tear the village apart." Naima felt a pang of guilt. She hadn't considered the full consequences of revealing the truth. Kalinda's name might be cleared, but the fallout could spark distrust and division. Still, she knew there was no turning back. "What should we do, Elder?" she asked. Abasi sighed deeply, his shoulders heavy with the weight of the decision. "We must call a council meeting at first light. The evidence will be presented, and Kwesi will have a chance to defend himself. The people deserve to hear the truth." As the elder spoke, a commotion erupted outside. Voices rose in alarm, and the sound of hurried footsteps echoed through the village. Naima's stomach twisted as she and Ayodele exchanged a glance. "Stay here," Abasi said, rising quickly. "I'll see what's happening." But before he could reach the door, it burst open. A young boy stumbled in, his face pale and his chest heaving. "Elder Abasi, Kwesi, he's at the square. He's calling a meeting." Naima's heart sank. Kwesi was moving faster than she had anticipated. "He's trying to get ahead of us," she said, her voice urgent. Abasi's jaw tightened. "Then we must face him now. Bring the chest." The square was a chaotic scene. Villagers gathered in a half-circle, their faces lit by the flickering torches. Kwesi stood at the center, his voice booming as he addressed the crowd. "Fellow villagers," he said, his tone heavy with authority. "I've called you here because a grave injustice has been committed against me and my family." The crowd murmured, confused. Naima pushed through the throng, Ayodele close behind her carrying the chest. Kwesi's eyes flicked toward them, and his expression darkened. "These two," Kwesi continued, pointing at them, "have stolen from me. They took something precious, something that belonged to my ancestors, and now they seek to use it to smear my name." The villagers gasped, their attention shifting to Naima and Ayodele. Abasi stepped forward, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "That is enough, Kwesi," the elder said firmly. "If there has been an injustice, it will be addressed, but we will hear all sides before casting judgment." Naima stepped into the circle, her hands trembling but her resolve steady. "Kwesi is lying," she said, her voice loud enough to carry. "What we found in the forest doesn't belong to him. It belongs to Kalinda, the man whose name your family destroyed." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Kwesi's face twisted in rage. "Lies! My family has always been honorable. This is nothing but an attempt to discredit us." But Naima was ready. She turned to Ayodele, who set the chest down and opened it. With shaking hands, she lifted the notebooks and maps for all to see. "These," she said, "are the records. They prove that Kalinda was framed, that your family took what was his and blamed him for their crimes. Elder Abasi has seen the evidence himself." All eyes turned to the elder, whose grave expression confirmed the weight of her words. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, some voices calling for justice, others demanding restraint. Kwesi took a step forward, his hands clenched into fists. "You don't understand what you're doing," he hissed. "This village will fall apart if you spread these lies." "Then maybe it needs to fall apart," Naima shot back, her voice trembling, but defiant. "Because a village built on lies is already broken." The square fell silent. The truth was out, but the battle was far from over. Naima could see it in the villagers' eyes, the doubt, the anger, the uncertainty. The path ahead was murky, and the weight of what she had set in motion pressed heavily on her chest. As the crowd began to disperse, Naima realized that exposing the truth was only the first step. What came next would test not only her courage but the very soul of Kalinda itself. The dawn broke over Kalinda with an unsettling stillness. The usually bustling village square was quiet, every door shut, every path empty. But inside the council hall, a storm was brewing. Naima stood at the far end of the room, her hands clasped tightly together as the elders filed in one by one. Each face was a mask of stern contemplation, their gazes heavy with the weight of the day's proceedings. At the center of the room sat Kwesi, flanked by two of his closest allies. His expression was one of calculated calm, though his clenched jaw betrayed his unease. Across from him was the chest of papers, its contents neatly arranged on a low table. Elder Abasi, seated at the head of the assembly, called for silence with a raised hand. "This is not a day any of us wished for," Abasi began, his voice steady and measured. "But the truth demands that we face it, no matter how difficult. Today we gather to examine the evidence brought forth by Naima and Ayodele, and to hear the response of Kwesi and his supporters. Let no voice go unheard, but let our judgments be guided by fairness and wisdom." The murmurs among the villagers subsided as Naima stepped forward. Her pulse raced, but she kept her voice steady. "Elders, villagers, I stand before you not out of pride, but out of duty. What I discovered in the forest was not something I sought for myself. It is something that belongs to all of us." She gestured to the chest. "These documents tell a story that has been buried for generations. They reveal how Kalinda was wrongfully accused and how his life was destroyed because of greed and deception. They show that the treasure we believed was stolen was, in fact, taken by Kwesi's ancestors, who then framed Kalinda to cover their tracks." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Kwesi leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. And what proof do you have that these papers are genuine? Anyone could have forged them to tarnish my family's name. Naima braced herself. She had anticipated this challenge. The handwriting matches Kalinda's own journals, which are still kept in the village archives, she said. And the maps align with trade routes from his time, routes only a merchant of his experience would have known. Elder Abbasi has examined them himself. All eyes turned to Abbasi, who nodded gravely. I have reviewed the documents, and I find no reason to doubt their authenticity. But the question before us is not simply about the past, it is about what we do with this knowledge now. Kwesi stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. This is a farce, he shouted. My family has served this village with honor for generations. We have built homes, fed the hungry, and led with strength. And now, because of some old scraps of paper, you would tarnish everything we've done? The room fell silent. Then Ayodele stepped forward. Honor is not built on lies, he said firmly. If your family truly cared for this village, they would have owned up to their actions long ago. Instead, they let an innocent man take the blame and suffer for their crimes. The tension in the room was palpable. Naima could see the villagers shifting uneasily, their faces a mix of doubt, anger, and curiosity. Some looked at Kwesi with sympathy, others with suspicion. Kwesi's voice dropped, but his words were no less sharp. Do you think uncovering this will make things better? Do you think it will bring Kalinda back or heal the wounds of the past? All you'll do is divide this village, pit neighbor against neighbor. Is that what you want? Naima hesitated. She hadn't considered the full weight of his words. What if he was right? What if exposing the truth only deepened the rift? But then she remembered the pain in Kalinda's eyes in the old stories, the injustice that had haunted her ancestors. This isn't about the past alone, she said, her voice quiet but resolute. It's about the future. How can we call ourselves a community if we allow lies to go unchallenged? If we want to heal, we have to start with the truth. Abbasi raised his hand again, calling for order. Enough, he said. The council will deliberate. Kwesi, Naima, you will both remain here while we consider the evidence and the testimonies. The elders withdrew to a side chamber, leaving the room heavy with tension. Naima felt Ayodele's hand on her shoulder, a small but steadying gesture. Across the room, Kwesi sat stiffly, his eyes fixed on the floor. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Finally, the elders returned, their faces grave. Abbasi spoke first. The council has reached a decision, he said. The evidence presented is compelling and aligns with our records of Kalinda's life. We cannot ignore what has been brought to light. However, we must also acknowledge the impact this will have on our village. He looked directly at Kwesi. Your family's actions have caused great harm, and you have continued that legacy by attempting to hide the truth. You will step down from your position as head of the Merchant Guild, effective immediately. The chest and its contents will be preserved in the village archives where all may see and learn from our history. Kwesi's face darkened, but he said nothing. Abbasi turned to Naima. You have done a great service to this village, but your journey is not over. The truth is a heavy burden, and it is now yours to carry. Use it wisely, and let it guide us toward reconciliation. The villagers began to disperse, their conversations a mix of relief and uncertainty. Naima felt a strange mix of emotions, vindication, but also the weight of responsibility. As she stepped out into the sunlight, she realized that the truth, while powerful, was only the first step. The real challenge lay ahead, helping her village heal from the wounds of its past. Behind her, Kwesi lingered in the shadows, his expression unreadable. Naima knew this wasn't the end of their conflict, but for the first time, she felt ready to face whatever came next. The days following the trial were some of the strangest in Kalinda's history. The air carried a mix of tension and curiosity, with villagers speaking in hushed tones about the revelations that had shaken the community. Everywhere Naima went, she could feel their eyes on her. Some were filled with admiration for her bravery, while others held caution, even skepticism. She had exposed the truth, but the scars it revealed ran deeper than she had anticipated. Naima sat at her family's table, staring at the documents that had ignited the storm. The pages were fragile, their edges frayed by time, yet their contents were unyielding in their weight. Ayodele sat across from her, silent but watchful. "You haven't said much since the trial," Naima said, breaking the quiet. Ayodele shrugged, his fingers tracing an invisible pattern on the wooden table. "What's there to say? You did what had to be done, but now what? The truth is out, but the village feels more divided than ever." Naima nodded. It was true. Though many villagers had rallied behind her, there were others who sympathized with Kwesi, seeing him as a victim of circumstance. He had been stripped of his status, but his supporters argued that punishing the son for the sins of the father wasn't justice. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. When Naima opened it, Elder Abbasi stood there, his face lined with exhaustion. "May I come in?" he asked. "Of course," Naima said, stepping aside. Abbasi entered, his presence commanding yet gentle. He looked at the papers on the table, then back at Naima. "I came to speak with you about what happens next," he said. "The trial may be over, but our work is far from finished. This village needs healing, and it will not come easily." Naima gestured for him to sit, her stomach nodding at his words. "I've been thinking the same," she admitted, "but I don't know where to start. People are angry, on both sides." Abbasi leaned forward, his hands clasped together. "We must begin with understanding. The truth you uncovered is painful, but it is also an opportunity. Kalinda can only move forward if we confront not just what happened, but why it happened." Naima frowned. "Do you mean talking to Kwesi?" "Yes," Abbasi said firmly. "His family's actions were wrong, but Kwesi has lived his entire life under their shadow. He may not be blameless, but he is not beyond redemption. If we can find a way to include him in this process, it could bring the village closer together." The idea made Naima's stomach churn. After everything Kwesi had done to silence her, the thought of sitting down with him felt unbearable. Yet she knew Abbasi was right. Reconciliation couldn't happen without addressing the divide. "I'll try," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. 2 days later, Naima found herself standing outside Kwesi's home, a small crowd watching from a distance. The air was thick with anticipation, as if the entire village was holding its breath. Kwesi opened the door, his expression unreadable. He looked thinner than she remembered, his usual commanding presence diminished. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice flat. "I want to talk," Naima said, her tone steady. "Not to accuse or fight, but to understand. Will you let me in?" Kwesi hesitated, his eyes narrowing. For a moment, Naima thought he might refuse, but then he stepped aside, allowing her to enter. His home was sparse, the furnishings simple but well kept. Naima sat on a low stool, her heart pounding as she tried to find the right words. "I know you're angry," she began, "and I know you feel betrayed, but this isn't just about you or me. It's about the entire village. If we keep letting this divide us, Kalinda will suffer." Kwesi folded his arms, leaning against the wall. "And what do you expect me to do? Apologize for something I didn't do? My family may have made mistakes, but I've spent my whole life trying to make up for them. Do you think it's fair to take everything from me because of their choices?" Naima took a deep breath. "It's not about taking from you. It's about making things right. If you truly care about this village, then help us rebuild it. Acknowledge what happened, and let's find a way forward together." Kwesi's jaw tightened, his eyes flickering with a mix of emotions, anger, guilt, and something else Naima couldn't quite place. "You think it's that simple?" he asked. "No," Naima admitted. "It's not simple at all. But it's necessary." Over the next week, Abbasi organized a series of gatherings in the village square. These weren't trials or debates, but open forums where villagers could share their thoughts, fears, and hopes. Naima and Kwesi both attended, their presence a powerful symbol of the effort to bridge the divide. At first, the meetings were tense. Villagers vented their frustrations, some accusing Naima of stirring trouble, others blaming Kwesi for his family's sins. But as the days went on, the conversations began to shift. Stories of Kalinda's legacy were shared, not just as a tale of injustice, but as a reminder of the resilience and unity that had once defined the village. Kwesi spoke sparingly, but when he did, his words carried weight. "I can't change what my family did," he said during one gathering, his voice heavy with emotion. "But I can do better. For Kalinda, for all of us." Naima watched him, feeling a flicker of hope. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a start. Months later, the tension in Kalinda had eased. The chest of papers had been placed in the village archives, alongside new records documenting the events that had unfolded. Naima continued to work closely with the elders, helping to organize education programs and cultural events that celebrated Kalinda's heritage. Kwesi, true to his word, had stepped back from his leadership role but remained an active member of the community. He and Naima were far from friends, but they had developed a mutual respect, bound by their shared commitment to the village's future. One evening, as the sun set over Kalinda, Naima stood on the edge of the forest, the place where her journey had begun. Ayodele joined her, his usual playful grin replaced by a quiet smile. "You did it?" he said. "We did it," Naima corrected, her gaze fixed on the horizon. As the village lights began to twinkle in the distance, Naima felt a sense of peace. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, Kalinda was moving forward, together.